you doing today? I've been promising this review ever since I first started doing the kilt bed, and the book in question, as you'll see, is quite large. Not sure if Grindel will cooperate. Herbert Crowley's The Temple of Silence. So let me set that down. Of course, since it is so big, I am going to take it in and open it up on the bed and show you the inside of it. But this was the book that first started my fascination with early American cartooning. And I believe it was kickstarted through Beehive Books. It was also my introduction to Beehive Books. Amazing publisher of wonderful, wonderful books. I now have more than a few of what they've published. They tend to be a little pricey, so I don't have everything. One time I wanted to live in a brownstone surrounded by books. I'm surrounded by books, don't have a brownstone. It's New York in the 21st century. I don't think that's ever gonna happen. But prior to Justin Duerr, who undertook this huge quest to bring to light Herbert Crowley's work, the only thing that had been printed previous to that, which I got because of that, was Dan Nadel's wonderful book, Art Out of Time, which collects a lot of great and wonderful cartoons, and they actually, but as you will see, this is the size that the Wiggle Muches were printed, which, while larger than your average book at the time, wasn't quite to the size of the broadsheets that we now, if you can afford them, you can read these comics in their original size, which is a wonderful thing. And I really appreciate it. There's another Crowley, John Crowley, who wrote the wonderful series Egypt, A-E-G-Y-P-T, might just be pronounced Egypt, who knows. But back when I was a stage magician, I was reading his series, and in it he said that there's a forgotten history to the world, and I believe Herbert Crowley is a perfect example of this forgotten history of the world. But as I said, this sparked my first quest, and then I moved on to the other greats, which we'll cover later on, especially Eddie Campbell's book, The Goat Getters, which is an essential read if you're interested in early cartooning. And Crazy Cat, Nemo and Summerland, all those wonderful pieces of work. But I'm rambling on once again. Surprise, surprise. I just wanted you to see this was the other one. And I love this book, by the way, because it has some great stuff in here, like the Dracula comics in here. Amazing. I'm so gonna steal from them. But anyways, let's get to it. Justin Duerr did a remarkable job. Beehive right behind him, making this amazing thing. And I don't want to review things on here that you can't actually obtain for yourself. So I'll put a link down below where you can purchase Temple of Silence from Beehive, and I would support them because they're a small publisher. And now that we're going through COVID and having these supply chain issues that everybody's talking about, probably every small publisher out there could benefit from our help. So anyways, I hope you enjoy the review, and let's get on with it. Love you. Bye. And here's the book itself. As I said, a little too large for me to open anywhere but on the bed. And as you can tell by here, there's a reason I put this sheet on the bed when I'm working in here, because I spill ink and all that type of stuff. Not just because of my beloved pigeons, who you can probably hear in the other room. So, what we have here is Herbert Crowley, not quite sure. I know he's British, so it may be the Crowley. We talked about this before. The Temple of Silence, His Forgotten Works and Worlds by Justin Duerr. And let me show you. This was my first Beehive book, I think. And I want to concentrate more on the book itself. Even though the story of Crowley is fascinating, I really want to... You can look that up on Wikipedia almost. I wanted to show you how great this book actually was. And I've kept... Is this an Obi strip? Is that what they would call it? I've kept the Obi strip on this because I treasure this book so much. Besides, there's this beautiful Wiggle Much in the back. And look at these end papers. I am a sucker for end papers. The only thing this book does not have is a sewn in ribbon bookmark, which You do, if you have beautiful end papers and a sewn in bookmark, oh, I will love the book no matter what. So here we have a self-portrait that Crowley did. Doesn't tell the date of it, unfortunately. I believe these are all the people that contributed to the Kickstarter, but I'm not sure. I did not contribute to this Kickstarter. I actually found out about this book through a review on the Comic Journal site. So, the Comic Journal, once again, taking tons of money from me. Congratulations, guys. And here we have, this is one of, we'll get to this story a little bit later, one of two prints that Crowley exhibited at the Armory show. This one is called Slander, and hopefully I've come in with enough detail. Let me get my fountain pen here. You can see all the beautiful work with the petals, these little animals down here. There's a little squirrel. Every time I look at this, I see something new within it. Like, oh look, there's a pigeon. Never noticed that before. This may be Chico and Sybil. We'll find out later. So Herbert Crowley himself, he was born in 1873, and originally he wanted to be an opera singer. That was what they thought, his family thought he was actually going to do. His mother was actually very proud of his accomplishments in the artistic sphere and would often write to their relatives about his accomplishments, which kind of is at odds with how he presented his life story to others. He tended to present his family as not really supporting himself, but he traveled to Paris, studied there to be an opera singer, and then returned to Toronto, Canada. So even though he's British and he's born in England, goes to Paris, ends up in Toronto, and he's actually working for the United Fruit Company, which that's where we get the term Banana Republic from. If you don't know the history of United States companies, the fruit companies, and their role in overthrowing governments, look it up. Fascinating history. But anyways, Herbert goes to Paris to study, comes to Toronto, and even though he said his family didn't support him, it appears that his brother Clement was the one that actually paid for a lot of his living expenses, as he would travel between Toronto and New York. And in New York, he ended up meeting a lot of who would become later influential people. At the time, it was just a bohemian crowd of artists, singers, musicians, this type of thing. So, while he's in New York, he meets John Frederick Mowbray Clark. I have to keep on practicing that pronunciation because I want to say Munbray, but it's Mowbray Clark. And John is teaching at the French School, which is a women's college in the Upper East Side. And while he's teaching there, he meets Mary Mowbray Clark. And obviously by the names, they get married. Her original name, I had it written down, but I'd forgotten. Buy the book. Fascinating anyways. And so the two of them settle down. It appears that Herbert Crowley is living with them. And in 1908, the Mowbray Clarks have their one and only child, a kid who they nicknamed Bumper. And the same year, they buy a small farm in Rockland County, New York, which I believe it was 55 acres. Anyways, they named it the Brocken after the highest mountain in Germany, that's where Mephistopheles takes Faust. And so they name the little artist community the Brocken. You can see here's a picture of a tent. I mean, it was pretty primitive living conditions at first for them. But Mary Mowbray Clark, I mean, she's a fascinating figure by herself, as you'll see as we go on. I think Justin Duerr is working on a biography of her, and I really, really hope so, because she's a fascinating figure. And here's more pictures of them at the Brocken. Here's a modern picture of the graveyard at the Brocken. And while they're at the Brocken, it's an artist community, but they're living extremely primitively. No running water, no electricity, in tents, building their own shelters, this type of thing. In this page, we have a lot of Crowley's sketches for the Wiggle-Much. These kind of very symbolist, flat, rounded figures. And Justin makes the argument that a lot of the Wiggle-Much was actually influenced by the paper theaters, which were popular at the time. And I think that's a valid argument just by the way you look at them. So while they're at the Brocken, two of Mary's students, who are sisters, and Alice and Irene Lewisham, I think was how you pronounce the last name. I should stop slapping my thigh. I apologize for that. But they met Herbert at the Brocken. And in 1924, Alice herself, she is an actress, a dancer, and a writer. I mean, as I said, very bohemian crowd. But she marries Herbert. Now, up until 1924, Herbert was totally terrified of financial ruin, not being able to support himself. The great thing is Alice and Irene are independently wealthy because their father started, I believe it's a smelting company. So she had, I think it was the equivalent of $300 million was willed to her when her father died. Now is when things get very interesting. We return to Mary Momboy Clark, and she gets together with a suffragette and writer named Madge Jennison, and they open a bookstore called the Sunwise Turn. Now, the Sunwise Turn wasn't meant to turn a profit. I think there were clashes in personality amongst the two of them, but you know, you live in a capitalist society, especially at this time. People expect you to make a profit. It seems as if Mary had bigger ideas. She thought in grander terms. So the entire, I wish there were color pictures of the bookshop from the descriptions, because it was painted according to theosophical ideas of different musical chords and feelings that colors could evoke. So orange was a predominant theme, so because that would encourage people to buy more books. And they also had fabric arts, they had all types of stuff. Justin Duerr has done an essay about how the Sunwise Turn was one of the, first of all, they serialized James Joyce's Ulysses in their own publication. I believe it's called The Little Radical. Not sure of that. I'll link to the essay down in the description. You should go read that. It's a nice long read. It gets really in-depth in the fascinating characters around the Sunwise Turn. But anyways, the Sunwise Turn and the Little Playhouse Theater, I believe it was called. Let's see here. Maybe it's back on this page. The Neighborhood Playhouse. So the Neighborhood Playhouse commissions Crowley to do some of their set directions, and Justin was doing such a thorough job of researching everything that he actually contacted this theater, which is still around, and asked them if they had any ephemera from Crowley's time, and they didn't think they did, but they invited him to look, and they actually found his set designs for one of the big pieces that they had done. So Justin did amazing work on this book. I mean, it's just fascinating. This is all before World War I, and this is kind of the problem, is the Clarks and Alice Lewison, they were all instrumental in organizing and funding the 1913 International Exhibition of Modern Arts, which we all know nowadays simply is the Armory Show. And in fact, like I said, with the opening piece Slander, and I believe it's the cover one that you see more in depth, this is the actual Temple of Silence print. Those two prints were at the Armory Show. And if you know anything about art during the early 20th century, you know how influential that show was. So Crowley starts getting shows, his shows start getting good reviews. He finally seems to be getting to the point where he can support himself with his visual art. However, World War I comes along, and he's in a bind because even though he's living in America, he's British. His wife is very anti-war and a pacifist. I believe Mary Momboy Clark was also a huge pacifist. Even the men that worked at the recruiting office were trying to talk him out of enlisting, couldn't be talked out of. He joined, and since he was an artist, they assigned him to the camouflage division. Now, as a former magician myself, the camouflage division during World War I is infamous. Its exploits are legendary, just some of the schemes that they came up with for dealing with the Germans, it's just a fascinating topic, and there's really good books on that. If you just don't use Google, go to DuckDuckGo, type in World War I, camouflage division, stage magicians, and there's a rabbit hole you can fall down forever. So anyways, Crowley does his time in World War I. There's not much known about it because, as has been my experience with most people who have gone through war, he didn't talk about it. If people talk about war, they probably have no idea. It's kind of like that old saying of the 60s, if you remember it, you weren't there. Well, if you talk about what happened to you in a war, you probably didn't have much going on. So Crowley, he's pretty closed-mouthed about the whole ordeal. He returns in 1924, marries Alice, and the two of them, using her money because, she's fabulously wealthy, they travel to Egypt, Greece, Burma, India, and what they were looking for, I keep trying to remember how Alice put it. I think it was transpersonal modes of expression. Because you have to remember, this is when the Theosophical Society is around. There's a lot of interest in Stirner. All these different schools of thoughts. We're starting to see the influence of the East coming into the West. The cross-pollination. Freud and Jung were, still relatively new. That's the terrible tragedy, I think, of this time period, is there was so much artistically, intellectually, philosophically going on, and then World War I comes along and just kills everything. So after they've been traveling around searching this type of thing, by the end of the 20s, the Crowleys moved to Zurich because they want to be closer to Carl Jung, because Alice had become very interested in Jung and his teachings, and they are both actually, is psychoanalyze the right term for Jungian? I have no idea. But anyways, they moved to Zurich, and they spend a number of years there as part of Jung's inner circle. Like I said, this story is fascinating, and I'm just glossing over the very tip of the iceberg. I want just to pique your interest in it, and then by all means, go out and buy this book because it is amazing. One of the things I forgot about the Sunwise Turn, Peggy Guggenheim volunteered there when she was younger, and it's probably what introduced her to a lot of avant-garde ideas, and you can even see evidence of its influence upon her first show. So now, this part of the book, we're going to start getting into more of just his artwork. And you can see these beautiful prints. The really sad thing about Herbert Crowley is nobody's quite sure when him and Alice separated, but by I think it's like 36 or something like this, he marries another woman, Wilhelmina, I'm going to screw up this pronunciation, Silaz, I think it is. Anyways, she co-owned a perfumery in Zurich, and that's how Herbert met her. So the two of them were married, and even to the end of his marriage with Alice, Herbert was questioning his life's work and whether he had been effective in making the world a better place, bringing light into the world versus the darkness, and probably influenced by everything he had been through, he thought his life's work was a failure. And it's said that during the last 2 years of his life, he burnt all of his paintings, would often use them to heat the laundry water. So the scraps that we have mainly come, and he actually asked, kind of like Kafka, to have all his works destroyed upon his death. The good thing is, Alice didn't do that and gave it to the Museum of Modern Art. And I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Madge, who helped start the Sunwise Turn, donated her collection of his art to the New York Public Library. And then there's some, Jung had a couple of pieces, and the Crowley family, I believe hit some pieces. And Justin Duerr has tracked down probably everything known to this point, and we're just hoping maybe there's like a treasure trove in an attic someplace of more of his work. I mean, you have these beautiful pieces, and then I love the whimsical feeling of his work. And you can kind of see here when he gets into the Wiggle Much cartoons, human figures almost become more like toy soldiers or wooden figures. Here they're still a little bit representational, but I love this Wiggle Much with the looks like eyeglasses tied on there. And see, you can start to see this where the figures are becoming more like little wooden soldiers that you would see. And this I'm especially delighted by. It's a series of wood panels that are joined by hinges. And so here you can see them laid out all flat. Here you can see them as they would be standing. And I apologize for going fast just because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I wanted to give you a taste of why this book is so wonderful. And I think all art forms are most interesting at the very beginning of their time, before they become codified and solidified into forms. So his early cartoon work is a prime example of this. Even with that said, his cartoons probably turned heads at the time. They were probably a little bit odd for the general population. But it's great because I love this one with the little Wiggle Much there. I mean, it's a fantastic figure, but it conveys a universal emotion. And his use of colors is simply gorgeous. And look, same thing here. I mean, you can see a lot of that. Sorry to bump the stand there. And here's another one. And I love this one because the title down here in French, but it's actually The Effect of the Moon is Extraordinary. And then look at this. That's just beautiful. Okay, so now we're into the Wiggle Much cartoons themselves. I'm gonna readjust the book, turn off the camera, turn it around, so make sure we've got this still in focus, and be right back. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that this was well in frame so you could see. And within the book, Justin has collected every known copy of the Wiggle Much, which I believe it's 14 of them actually ran, but they started in 1910 in the New York Herald. And this is at a time when, like as I said, comic strips were not new, but they were relatively fresh and modern, and they had them codified into a distinct shape. So these old broadsheet cartoons are gorgeous, and I love books that publish them full size. Even though they're a little bit clumsy to wield, I absolutely adore them. And here you can totally see the humanist figures are very much appear as toy soldiers, which contrasts nicely with the rounded forms, the more empathic forms of the Wiggle Muches. And I love this down here of them trying to put a Wiggle Much into armor. And as you go along, these are just these beautiful vistas that you can see within here. And it seemed with each strip that he did, he got stronger. And he found his voice more within those comics. But they also took an almost sinister turn. And you can, here's the one, see this little one with the wizard. And I love this little light chart that's going on in the back. Like, there's so many details within these strips that are so gorgeous that, I don't know. It blew me away the first time that I actually saw this. The combined effect of the strips and then his prints. But here's this one where, you know, the rogue Wiggle Much. And so you can see it gradually taking on a darker turn as it proceeds, which it may be why it ended so quickly, but it may be that, you know, Herbert Crowley, by all accounts, was a perfectionist. I mean, he wanted his oeuvre destroyed. So, I don't quite know what was going on. But here you can see where he's doing the layout. So I don't believe this one was published. And now that we're at the end of that, once more, I will pause the camera and flip it around. Want to give you the best possible view here. So here you can see we're gonna get into the prints and some of the sculptures. And this one is entitled Nightmare. This comes from the Crowley estate in Zurich. But you can see, I love this weird little one-legged bird. The fact that I live with Sibylla and Hayward means I kind of understand that stance that's going on there. But I love how this almost has a Tibetan influence to it. You can see everything that he was going through. And here's an example of his clay or plaster sculptures. And his sculptural work reminds me a lot of Clark Ashton Smith's work. I believe it was Hippocampus Press that brought out the large book, which unfortunately I do not own, of Clark Ashton Smith's drawings and sculptures. But, you know, I have lusted over the pictures on the web. So eventually I may pay the high scalper prices for a used copy. But look at these. I mean, these are adorable. That looks like it's brass. Not quite sure. I should have figured that out before. But a lot of these look like they were brass. Yeah, it just says figurines. Sorry about that, but look at this. It's so good. Makes me so verklempt. And then you have these beautiful prints. These are at the Museum of Modern Art. And then look at how evocative these are. That was one of the things that came out. I believe Mary Momboy Clark, she had been a governess in England, and I think it says within here that she studied with Whistler for a time. So the interconnection of all these people who weren't necessarily famous at that time, but then later on grew in significance is astounding. I love this one. His pieces are so evocative. And look at the beauty, just the tonal shifts in this. Oh, makes me verklempt. Give me my swinging couch. Yes, and so here you can see the beautiful greens, you know, more of the Museum of Modern Art pieces. And then look at this. I don't think this is titled. I'm sure I'll be corrected if it actually is. But look at especially with Halloween coming. I mean, every day is Halloween. Is that Ministry? But these are so great. I mean, that long, ghoulish kind of humped. It's almost a Japanese yokai. And then you have this one here. And then more of like a traditional, maybe Nosferatu vampire type thing. And then this woman. She would not be out of place within a gothic, like a Radcliffe novel. And then here we have more of his fantastic landscapes. And then I love this. Like, you can see him laying out the design scheme with here, the amount of work that just goes into this. And this almost Celtic knotwork going on there. And then I'm gonna screw up his name. I've looked this up. I've read a lot of his work, but my pronunciations suck. I'm an autodidact. But Padraig Colomb did the poem on this, and Herbert Crowley did the actual drawing for it. I believe this was released by the Sunwise Turn because they would print broadsheets. And then here you can start to see, you know, his highly detailed work. And I love the broadness of his line on these leaves that we have here. And I think it's somewhere in here he talks about how anguished he was because one of the lines that he used for a pedal was too thick. So, and this is when he's, you know, probably dozens of hours into the drawing, and it just vexes him for the rest of the drawing. He can't forget that one line that's so broad. And it's just perfect. Like, I've always loved the story about it's in a gory interview where he talks about completing one of his more complex drawings, then one of his mini cats knocked over a bottle of India ink, so he was like, had to do it all over again. But just look, I'm hoping the camera catches the detail for you. Just all this line work. It kind of remembers you. I think it was in the Wolf book where Kesey talks about he always thought that all the comic book artists were doing lots of meth because they could draw those teeny tiny little details, and then later on he learned that they drew them large and shrunk them down, and it blew his mind. So this is the Temple of Love print that he did. A monogram that he designed. This one, I've always loved the haunt. I just love, it's such a whimsical expression on this, what should be a fearsome creature, but it's not. It's absolutely adorable simply by the way he rendered it. Here we have the Temple of Dreams. Oh, this is the Temple of Silence here. So let's see. Is that the front? Nope. Screwed that up. Maybe we'll figure it out. Maybe it's the Temple of Dreams. There it is. This is the Temple of Dreams. Yep. So the front piece is the Temple of Dreams. I'm not gonna force you to watch me turn the camera off and turn it around just so you can see more, but the details in this, once again, absolutely astounding. Cannot believe how much work was put into this, and it's so uniform. And Crowley talked about he wanted his prints to be just as crisp as the originals, and Justin says that he succeeded in that point. In the prints that he's seen, they have that strength of line that is present in Crowley's originals, which, if you know anything about printmaking, that's pretty astounding. Look at all these. Like I said, I enjoy it. It's kind of like Proto-Escalade Wilson, and I've heard, I'm not sure if it's through this book or otherwhere, but when MoMA did put up their Crowley piece, like a lot of the underground cartoonists, such as Escalade Wilson, Robert Crumb and such, maybe not them specifically, but that crowd came to see them because they were blown away by Crowley's work. So it's been kind of known up until now. I think it was only printed previously. I can't remember the name of the book. I'll put it across the bottom. I also have that in my collection, so maybe I'll hold that up. Do this afterwards. Then you have your acknowledgement and thanks. List of exhibitions, and we are at the end. So hopefully I didn't annoy you too much, and I hope I piqued your interest in actually purchasing a copy of this wonderful book. In case you didn't know, Justin Duerr also did, which I didn't know at the time, I found this out later, he made one of my favorite documentaries, and I love documentaries, but he did a documentary called Resurrect Dead, the story of the Toynbee tiles. Definitely look that up. I'll put a link to the trailer for that. Another fascinating glimpse into forgotten history, I think is the best way to put it. So anyways, thanks for putting up with that, and see you in a bit. Love you. Bye.